Your podcast does not have to stay the same forever, and in fact, it actually should be evolving with you and your business. So in this Espresso Shot episode, I'm getting all into the details of how you can have a podcast for years and years while it evolves with you and your business. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Something that I see a lot in this space is people rebranding when their podcast no longer 100% fits their business. Because think about it, we always have different offers. We're always learning. With the rise in AI, it's shifting a lot of our businesses. And the last thing I want you to do is have all the work you've created from the podcast be basically deleted and restarted. Of course, if there's a huge shift, like whole topic shifts, yeah, maybe it is time to start a new podcast feed. But for the most part, your podcast is allowed to shift with you, and actually it should be. Because here's what I want you to remember. Podcasting is not a life sentence. It's a creative tool that can grow with your business and your voice. The longer I podcast, of course the topics change. I've been podcasting since 2018, and the things I've learned from then until now, like, yes, of course, what I offer is different. My views on podcasting are different. The knowledge I have is all different. And that doesn't mean I have to restart. It just means as I shift, my podcast shifts with me. So let me give you an example. When I started my other podcast, Employee to Boss, I started that in 2021. I was a year into business and was interviewing a lot of people that I have never met before. Right. I was using it as a marketing tool. So I was interviewing people left and right that I was meeting on Instagram, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, whatever. I did a season of that, maybe like a long season, probably about 40 episodes. So not quite a season, but I did about 40 episodes of that. And then I realized I had a little bit more knowledge in podcasting and business. I knew more people. People were introducing me to people. So I decided to shift a little bit and still keep the topic of the episode very, very similar, but interview people that I had met, whether it was networking, whether it was like through a referral, whatever it is, I shifted to interviewing people that I knew. Okay. So I did that for, probably another 40 episodes or so, maybe 30. And then I was shifting back and forth between people I knew, people I didn't know. The format of the podcast stayed the same, but what shifted was my, knowledge of like the person I was interviewing. So it kept it really interesting for me just to build connections more, but also meet a ton of new people. I want to share another example that might be a little different than the one I just shared about my own podcast. I have a client that came to me with a podcast about mindset and mental health. And for a while she was doing that and it was really, really successful. She loved doing it. But then it came to the point where she was like, I think I want to talk about more business mindset, business mental health, which of course is a big shift because some people that were listening don't have businesses, right? Of course, they probably work, but owning a business and working for a company are different mindsets that you have to have. So she was afraid that when she switched to talking about business mindset, she would lose some listeners. And I told her, yeah, you probably will, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. In fact, you should, because you are teaching people business. And if they want to buy into your services, which of course we all want to make sales from our podcast, then yeah, it's more aligned. So yes, you might lose some listeners who might not feel aligned with the podcast, but you'll attract listeners who will feel more aligned with the podcast and what your business offers. So yeah, like expected, when she made the shift, we changed the logo, we changed the music, the name stayed the same, the branding stayed the same, the messaging changed, and that we did an episode kind of shifting it around, kind of releasing or letting the audience know what was going on. And honestly, people were excited. Yes, some listeners dropped off, but you wouldn't even be able to tell because of the listeners it attracted. So while I think that's a big concern of like, am I going to lose all my listeners from this? The answer is no. You'll attract better, more aligned listeners. So I want you to remember that just because you have to shift stuff around in your podcast, just because you might be rebranding, just because it doesn't feel aligned anymore, doesn't mean that you're stuck with it. You're allowed to change. And that doesn't mean that you are a failure in the podcast, or that doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. We are ever evolving people. And if we stayed talking about one topic forever, we would all be really bored, right? So actually, I encourage change within my clients' podcasts. When I start working with them, we come up with a strategy. Of course, I talk about like, who do they want to attract listening? It should be the same as who you're attracting in your business, right? Because the podcast is an extension of that. So I want to hear, what they want to talk about. And then when they're 10 episodes in, which is not very long, I check in. I'm like, okay, what topics are you loving? We look at what the audience is loving. A year in, I'll recheck and be like, does this still feel aligned? I encourage change. And my advice to you is you should encourage change too and be honest with yourself, because if you can change slowly from one topic to the next, tying them in together, it's going to not feel as harsh to your listeners. So just like my client who had the mindset podcast that then went to business mindset. Well, yes, it's not a huge shift. We did have, that episode talking about what the change was that was coming. Before she actually launched that, she talked a little bit more about business in the episodes before we had that topic shift. But, the longer you give yourself to slowly transition, the easier it is for your listeners to jump on board and get excited about it too. So I want to share some tips for evolving gracefully, like I just mentioned. Let your audience in on the journey. Okay, they're listening to you. They feel bought in on your brand, on your podcast, whatever it is. They want to know what's going on behind the scenes, and you can be really honest with them. And I find that those episodes are sometimes the best ones that your audience really feels like they're on the journey with you. So don't feel like you have to do this sneakily behind the scenes. Really let them know about what's going on. I also think that you should, while you're through this process of transitioning topics or rebranding or whatever it is, continue to reintroduce your show and yourself regularly, because when you're shifting topics, you're going to be attracting new listeners. So if you already are, one of my biggest pet peeves is when you listen to a podcast and they give no intro on who they are, no details, and you're like, who is this person? Okay. It's hard to jump in at a random episode, so treat every episode like someone's first time listening, because it probably is, okay? So make sure that they feel like they know who you are and what you do and what you believe in, and that could just be through the intro to the podcast. And then lastly, I really encourage you to pivot. If you don't feel inspired, if you feel like your podcast is burning you out, pivot. I really think that is the best thing to do. In the next episode, I'm talking to Crystal Edwards, who is the host of Grit City Women, a podcast that has been with her for multiple stages in her life, from being single to, shutting down her in-person business during the pandemic, to getting married and having kids and going through different health situations. And the podcast has transitioned with her. And I really want you to listen to this episode because it is a great example of how it can happen and really the results she's seen from keeping it feeling aligned to her and her soul. It's a really great episode, so I cannot wait for you to listen to that. But if you're feeling like your podcast needs a refresh, you know I'm always here to assist you. My business is Espresso Podcast Production. You can reach out on Instagram or my website, and I love helping podcasters who have a business really align their business and their podcast, because that is where the magic happens. Okay, well, that's all for today's Espresso Shot episode. I will catch you in the next episode.